Putin doesn't just want to end the war. He wants to redesign the map of Europe. And the price for that? The NATO retreat. The war in Ukraine has only become the visible epicenter of a geopolitical earthquake that shakes the whole of Europe. Vladimir Putin is not only interested in Donetsk or Lugansk, he wants NATO to retain. Literally. Outside Poland, outside Romania, outside Estonia, outside Lithuania. Outside where he considers his strategic backyard. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO has expanded from 16 to 31 countries. For the West, this was a natural process, driven by the Eastern European countries themselves in search of protection. But for Putin, that was a historical humiliation, a silent betrayal. According to Kremlin, the presence of the Atlantic Alliance in Poland, Romania, and the Baltic countries is more than a discomfort. It is a provocation, a real threat, and he makes no ceremony to say, as long as there are NATO troops in the east, there is no possible negotiation. After the invasion of Ukraine, NATO did exactly what Moscow feared. It further reinforced its presence in Eastern Europe. Today there are thousands of additional soldiers, missile systems, aircraft, and permanent warning ships. For Russia, this is not a defense. It is climbing. Now Putin requires what he calls definitive solution for this presence. In practical terms, this would mean the dismantling of NATO's advanced forces in the east, something no member country would accept in a good way. That is, Putin is demanding the impossible. And maybe that's the point. He doesn't just want to end the war. He wants to ensure that at the end of it NATO is further from its borders and its weaker influence. One of Putin's main arguments is a supposed verbal pact made between the West and Gorbachev in the 1990s, promising that NATO would not expand an inch to the east. This pact was never written. It was never signed. And according to most historians, it has never been an informal conversation. But Putin treats this story as if it were a sacred treaty. For him, each new country that entered NATO after 1991 represents a violation of this invisible agreement. It is based on this narrative that Kremlin says he is right to demand a new balance, or rather a new imbalance in his favor. The war will not end only with retreating tanks or a treaty signed in Kiev. According to Putin, she only ends up if NATO leaves the board. But is the West willing to retreat? Or let's move on to an increasingly dangerous impasse, where the next move can be expensive, very expensive. The central question Putin raises is old, but has returned in full force. How far does NATO's safety go before becoming a threat to Russia's safety? This tension did not start with the Ukraine war. She has been accumulating since the 1990s, when former Soviet republics began to ask to enter NATO. Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, they all ran into the arms of the West, not because they were forced, but because they feared being satellites of Moscow. For them, NATO's presence is a guarantee of survival. But for Kremlin, this is how to wake up every day with a knife pointed at the neck. And here comes the dilemma that makes any negotiation extremely fragile. What for Eastern European countries is a shield, for Russia is a sword. What for NATO is dissuasion, for Putin is provocation. This game of mirrors distorts the reality on both sides. Russia claims to be defending itself from NATO's expansion. NATO, in turn, claims to be only responding to Russian aggressiveness. One accuses the other of taking the first step. And while this endless dispute drags on, who bleeds is Ukraine. Now Moscow says with all the letters, just sits to negotiate if NATO makes practical steps. And what would these steps be? One would be to end any possibility of future adhesion from Ukraine to the alliance. Another would be to remove troops and weapons from the regions near the Russian border. Russia wants written, legally binding guarantees that the West will maintain distance. The problem is that accepting this means turning Ukraine into a neutral zone forcibly, something that the Ukrainian government itself has already made it clear that it does not accept. In addition, giving up the military presence in Eastern Europe would be to abandon countries combined with their own luck. Something like Biden, nor any other NATO leader can sell internally. The climate gets worse with the expectation of a possible return from Donald Trump to the presidential presidency of the United States. For Kremlin, this would represent a golden opportunity. Trump has already given signs in his previous term, which he considers to NATO a burden. He even threatened to remove the US from the alliance. For Putin, an American president who sees NATO as a waste of money and time can be the ideal partner to redesign European security architecture in Moscow. Kremlin sources have already indicated that they are aware of the US electoral scenario and expect 2025 to bring more favorable winds. But if Putin believes time is by his side, Europe thinks differently. Since the beginning of the war, there has been a brutal leap in investments in defense of European countries. Germany, Sweden, Finland, Poland all increased their military budgets dramatically. Finland's entrance to NATO, followed by Sweden, was exactly the opposite of what Putin wanted. Instead of pushing the covenant, he pushed her even closer. The shot came out for the culatter, and this only reinforces the perception that any concession made to Kremlin, instead of appeasing, can feed the next climb. In the background, the Russian requirement that NATO recede is not just a military agenda. It is symbolic. It is an attempt to restore a great power status that Moscow lost at the end of the Cold War. For Putin, the current conflict is not just about territory or weapons. It is about respect, about being treated as equal to the Western powers, about having veto power in the strategic decisions of Europe. It is a demand for recognition, masked requirement for security. But the recognition that Putin wants perhaps costs more than the West is willing to pay. Especially now, with the war still ongoing, tens of thousands of dead, increasingly severe sanctions, and an abyss of distrust between Moscow and the rest of the world. And in the midst of all this is Ukraine, which continues to resist, suffering, and trying to avoid being swallowed by a war that goes far beyond its borders. While Ukraine struggles for survival, the world watches an impasse that seems to have no way out. On the one hand, Putin insists that there will only be peace with firm guarantees that NATO will retreat, ending its expansion and removing military presence from areas that Kremlin considers strategic. On the other, NATO replies that it will not give in to blackmail, and that each country has the sovereign law to choose its alliances. No side wants to look weak. No side wants to take the first step backwards. And while this tense dance continues, the war continues to consume resources, lives, and the stability of the European continent. But the most worrying thing is that this dispute is not just in the trenches or presidential palaces. It begins to contaminate society, the political discourses, the elections. In countries such as Germany, France, and even in the United States, the pressure of populist groups grows, asking for the end of support for Ukraine, arguing that their own countries are paying too expensive for a war that is not theirs. This internal erosion in the West is all that Putin wants. He knows he cannot defeat NATO militarily, but you can expect it to wear out politically. And in that, he is patient, very patient. Meanwhile, Ukraine remains the front line, but also, increasingly, the field of testing for the future of Europe. Because if Russia can double Ukraine, impose its terms, and redesign European security by force, the message will be given. The world has been ruled by the logic of the spheres of influence. A world in which great powers dictate the fate of the little ones, where force overcomes the right, in which treaties, agreements, and sovereignty are worth less than missiles, tanks, and geopolitical blackmail. This is what is at stake. More than territories, we are talking about the concept of security in the 21st century. If Putin wins, other authoritarian leaders around the world will take note. The message will be clear. With persistence, brutality, and time, you can reverse decades of diplomacy and democratic achievements. The border of Ukraine may well be the new zero point of the world order. At the same time, ignoring Russian demands also has a price. The risk of even greater climbing with direct NATO involvement, or even an open conflict between great powers, is a ghost that haunts all European leaders. A false step, a calculation error, and the war that is now located can become global. Therefore, even when they claim that Putin does not say the terms, diplomats continue to look for loopholes, windows, intermediate formulas. But the more time it passes, the harder it is to find a way out that does not involve humiliation to one side. And in this game, no one wants to be the loser, and there is an uncomfortable question that begins to circulate in the corridors of power. Can the war in Ukraine still be overcome? Or are we just postponing the inevitable, pushing the crisis forward without solving the root of the problem? Because Deep down, Putin's requirement NATO's retreat is not just about security. It is over dominion, about control, about redesign the balance of global forces. And if the West accepts, even partially, this requirement, the precedent will be devastating. In the end, the war in Ukraine is just the surface. The true conflict is deeper. It is about the future of Europe, about what will be tolerated and what will be resisted, where to draw the line. And this line, no matter how faint it may seem, can be the last limit between peace and chaos.